Strap in, guys, because this is going to be a long one. Hello and welcome to PolyCosm. My name's Christina and today we'll be taking John's lantern sketch from last week and creating the Basemesh in Blender before taking it into 3D code for some detailed sculpting and stencil work, and then bringing the lantern back in Blender to work on the texturing, the ropes and the cloth wrapped around the lantern. Alright, let's get started. So first off, I wanted to go over how I made the lantern in Blender, and just in case you didn't watch last week's video, which if that's the case, shame on you, or maybe you didn't remember John's sketch, this is the final sketch that he finished last week. I'll be using the orthographic views of the lantern as reference, but I want to add little personal touches whenever the need arises, so I'm not constricting myself too much and forcing myself to make it 100% accurate, you know. When it comes to more hard surface modeling and sculpting, I tend to start blocking out shapes using a cube with a subdivision modifier on top. That way I get an easily editable mesh I can extrude and use to get the general silhouette down. When you're in edit mode, you can add in loops wherever you want the form to be sharper, so if you add it close to an edge, yeah, you guessed it, that edge will get sharpened. In hindsight, I've realized that using the cube isn't exactly ideal for round shapes like the lantern, because even with a subdivision modifier thrown on top, it sort of retains those cube edges, which makes it a bit box shaped, but hey, it was only ever intended for blocking out forms, so later on I did end up replacing some of those shapes. As you can see, I'm pretty much using a lot of just basic shapes such as cylinders, spheres, cubes, etc. No need to get fancy just yet. Our first priority in the blockout phase is just to get the silhouette and volume down. I keep repeating this in all of my sculpting videos. I'm sorry if you're so sick of hearing it, but it is so tempting to jump into details, but there's just, I don't know, there's just something satisfying about the blockout stage, I find. Even with painting, I'm always the most excited about the project in the beginning, where the possibilities are endless. And the more I work on the project, the more I kind of get bored, I guess. Does anyone else feel like that? For me, that final paint over stage is where you're just cleaning up and adding in all those tiny little details. It's just the worst. I dread that stage in every painting. Going back to the sculpt, you can see me adding some bevels here and there as mental notes. It may not be wise at this stage, but those little details thrown in here and there makes me more excited about working on the sculpt. I try not to work too destructively here though, because once you have the entire thing blocked out, you'll get a more accurate idea of how to move forward with the sculpt, and you might curse out your past self for adding in those details too early. So here I wanted to make the chain rings by merging a plane in edit mode using M and pressing merge at center, and started extruding the vertex to form a sort of zero shape. Using loop cut will allow you to add in more vertices in between existing vertices, and once I was happy with the shape, I threw in a subdivision modifier to smooth it out, duplicated all of the vertices with Shift D and sized it down to fit the middle. I then started filling out the space by selecting 4 vertices at a time and pressing F for fill. Throw in a solidify and subdivision modifier and you got yourself a chain ring. Now for these bits, I originally thought of using the skin modifier, but the shape ended up being a bit too rounded, so I went with a solidify modifier instead to get harsher edges. If you're wondering what I mean by using the skin modifier technique, I'll link to an earlier video where I talked about this more in detail and did a demonstration. Just jump to 508 and you should find it. I've added in chapters to make it easier to find those little bits in all of our videos. So yeah, once I was happy with the shape, I duplicated it and just rotated it around. Now for the outer rims encasing the glass. Oh boy. I wasn't quite sure how to approach these, but what I did was duplicate the middle bit of the lantern, mirrored it around, added in loops, and started changing the surface vertices to match up with the reference plane. I'm not sure if this is honestly the most effective way, but it kind of worked, I guess. So yeah, once I had one bit I thought looked alright, I deleted all other parts and started mirroring this bit around. I eventually added in edge loops to the outer edges to keep those sharp and added in a solidify and subdivision modifier. The top and bottom bits ended up looking a bit ugly, so I decided to hide these with cylinders. I know, it's kind of like cheating. Time for some Boolean action. You'll see me using these a lot during this blockout phase. First, I wanted to use them to get those holes on the top lid part, so I created a super basic shape, and in edit mode I used the spin tool, which I've actually never used before, but it's so handy. I would highly recommend using it. If you want to use it non-destructively though, go for an array modifier attached to an empty or something. For this instance, it worked perfectly fine. Once I was done with the shapes, I chose the top lid, added in a Boolean modifier, and chose the shapes I just created. If you want to know more about this process in detail, go to the same video I mentioned before, but jump to 8:17 instead. I give a quick demonstration on how Booleans work in Blender. I repeated this process for the grid holes, but started off with choosing some of the faces of the upper lantern where the grid would go, pressed Shift D to duplicate these, and then pressed P to separate the selection. This will serve as our grid. Again, I added in a solidify modifier to add some proper thickness and moved it outwards. Repeating this process once more, but this time for the purpose of getting some grid hole booleans, I duplicated some faces, added a solidify modifier, and used these as the boolean shapes to cut some holes through our grid. I really love working with booleans, if you can't tell. It's great. And as if you weren't already sick of listening to me gush about booleans, I used them to carve out the insides where the glowing bugs would reside. Since we'll be adding glass to the lantern, we need the inside to look good as well. I ended up cheating a bit with the glass and added them only to the parts that would be visible from the outside, like the grid, the top holes, and of course the main body. And for the tracks where the grid would slide, I used simple circles with the solidify modifier as a boolean shape. I swear this will be the last of me talking about booleans. For this video at least. Woo! We're done with the Basemesh! I added in super basic materials to get an idea of how the lantern would look like shaded, and was pretty happy. If you're wondering about the nice lighting and backdrop, I used an add-on called Physical Starlight and Atmosphere, which lets you add and simulate accurate lighting conditions from the sun. And it also has a night mode with starry skies and so on. I love this add-on, it saves me so much time. Link in the description and pinned comment below if you're interested. Okay, let's jump to part 2, where we will start sculpting some details in 3D code. Before I jumped into 3D code, I made sure that I voxel remeshed all of the lantern parts except for the mirror, which I won't be importing of course. The reason I did this is because I want to use the voxel sculpting system in 3D code, and you'll get better importing results if you voxel remesh your model first. I made sure that I had the grid as one model and the rest as another model. And in sculpt mode, I went to remesh and set the voxel size fairly low to get a denser mesh. If you hit Shift R, you'll get a little preview grid where you can see how small the faces will become when remeshed. If you're satisfied, you can press Ctrl R to confirm. So this is the first time I've really touched on 3D code on our channel, and if you're unfamiliar with it, its strong suit lies in its voxel sculpt capabilities. Sculpting in 3D code feels more organic in my opinion. I'll show you all of the brilliant tools later on, but the way I started this one was to use the cutoff tool and cut off the chain bit at the bottom. Next, I started using Voxel, which lets you paint in strokes where you want to hide the model, and this is a brilliant way to add some damage and broken off areas. I want to give the impression that this lantern has been through some pretty rough terrain, weather, and of course ambushes. NURBEK, our character, traverses dangerous roads and guides people through horrible weather conditions, so this needs to be reflected in the lantern design. That's why I thought 3D code would be perfect actually. It's just much easier to achieve this type of organic look in there. Plus, the shaders are freaking awesome, I love them. So the way you use Voxel is to paint in the parts you want to hide, and you can paint while holding Control to bring it back. If you want to change the type of stroke or even use shapes or lasso tool, you can press E to bring up the stroke menu. God, this just feels so organic and dynamic, like you're working with proper clay. It's great. I honestly haven't used 3D code in over a year, and I realized just how much I missed it while sculpting this. I'll probably be using it in a few videos moving forward. Hopefully you guys won't mind. The other main reason I adore 3D code is the way you can use stencils. You basically pick an alpha from the stencil section on the right, overlay that in the viewport, and use the tools at the top to size it up, tile it, stretch it, and so on. Then, when you're satisfied, you can use the build tool to paint in the stencil details. Your sculpt can go from, I guess that's cool, to holy crap, that is so detailed, real quick using this method. If you hold Control while painting, you can inverse the painting direction. Since our character NURBEK is pretty exotic, I wanted the lantern to reflect that too, so I tried to find some alphas in line that would give off that impression. Pro tip, if you found a black and white alpha online, make sure to blur the image slightly before using it. You'll just get better looking results from that, just trust me. Also, if you want to use Symmetry, and that includes radial symmetry, just press S to bring up that menu. Symmetry in combination with the build tool and stencils is awesome. I mean, just look at this, it's magic. By the way, whenever the neutral blue background is present in the viewport, it means that I'm in orthographic view. You can switch between orthographic and perspective view by pressing numpad 5. If you want to align the view to front, side, top, or bottom, press Shift while navigating the viewport and it will snap automatically. I used a few primitives to add in some extra cylindrical rims here and there to reinforce the structure. I don't want the lantern to lose its shape, which can be easy when you're voxel sculpting. The brilliant thing about adding in primitives in voxel mode is that it will kind of melt to your model once you press apply. If you find you're not getting crisp enough details when stencil painting or adding geometry to your sculpt, it's probably time to res up your sculpt. If you scroll down to your command list on the left and press Res Plus, you'll add 1 round of resolution. This is indicated by the now 2x sign. Be careful, because the higher the number, the more your computer chugs. You can also resample if you want to be specific or your sculpt has become too dense. So I should probably explain what the difference between voxel sculpting and polysculpting is. So when you're sculpting with voxels, you're basically dealing with volume. Cut into a voxel sphere and it won't be hollow, but it will have the entire form filled out, just like clay. Whereas, if you cut into a poly-modeled sphere in Blender, you'll see it's hollow in the inside, and what you've actually been sculpting on is its surface. Blender currently doesn't feature proper voxel sculpting features, but Pablo de Barro is apparently working on this behind the scenes. He wants to eventually incorporate sculpting in VR in Blender, which requires a voxel-based system to be in place first. I cannot wait for that day. Until then, 3D code is an amazing alternative. It's very intuitive and super easy to learn. It costs about $99 to $379, which is crazy cheap compared to other software. Alright, let's jump into part 3. So I'm not going to go into too much detail in this part because this is the first time I've ever worked this way. But if you want a more in-depth explanation, I highly recommend Jose Vega's background design for animation pipeline tutorial, which is where I learned all about this. In short, I right-clicked the mesh, chose Read Topo via decimation and set the percent to about 95%. The mesh was 10 million polys high here in 3D Code, and I do not want that imported into Blender. I don't even know if my computer would allow me, to be honest. After this, I pressed Mark Seams on the left menu, chose Auto Seams. This will automatically create a UV unwrap for you. Then choose the Bake menu at the top, hit Bake with Normal. I usually leave the scan depth window alone and hit OK. For the texture output, I usually choose 4K or 8K textures. Since I want the prop to be very detail rich, I went with 8K. Then I headed into Paint mode, and in View, I unhooked Show Voxels in Paint Room, because this displays a high-res sculpt instead of our newly decimated sculpt. You can see the difference if I hook and unhook this option. I think 3D Code does this so well, it's fantastic. As the final step, head into File and press Export Objects and Textures. Now, originally I had merged and exported the model as one big model, but I wanted the grid to be a separate mesh, so I had to repeat this step and make sure I didn't merge the grid with the lantern. For the export options, I chose PNG and added in roughness and metalness as well, as these are important texture maps we'll be using in Blender. Hit OK, and let's head into Blender. Alright, final stretch. In Blender, I imported the new sculpt and had to size it down to fit the original size of the lantern. I switched to rendered mode to see if the textures looked alright, which it did, but was missing a few maps, and some of the maps were placed a bit wrong. I'm not going to go into too much detail here as I want to touch on this in another future quick tips video, but in short, I basically took the exported maps and hooked them to the lantern shader. Once all of the textures were in place, I pressed Ctrl G to create a group. This is going to be our main lantern shader. I also wanted to create a moss shader and mix that in using a mix shader and mapping it to a specific axis. So for the moss shader, I created a principled BSDF shader, like the lantern shader, and started dropping in textures I had downloaded online and hooking them up to the appropriate inputs. I hooked this up to the second input in the mix shader node and grouped it as well. Next, I added in a texture coordinate, a separate XYZ, and a color ramp. And as a final step, I hooked these up to the factor input in the mix shader node. After some experimenting, this is how the shader set ended up looking. And this is the lantern shader. And here is the moss shader. Since the moss shader was mapped to the separate XYZ node and set to Y, I could use the color ramp to choose just how soft and harsh this transition was. Pretty cool, huh? If you're looking for a full tutorial explaining this, Jose Vega has a brilliant rock kit with a tutorial explaining how this effect was achieved. If you're not too keen on spending too much money on tutorials, which I get, just wait around for a sale. ArtStation store has a lot of sales going on at all times. I actually decided to switch out the moss texture with another moss texture that had a bit more variation and interest. All I had to do was just replace the old texture maps with the new ones. This just ended up looking nicer in my opinion. So before I could wrap up this sculpt, I had to add in some ropes and cloth. I used the bevel curve tools, which I'll link in the description and pin comment below. I find this to be a very easy way of creating organic ropes, cables, etc. You basically just move the handles around, and if you want to add more edit points, you can choose 2 points close to each other, right click, hit subdivide, and you'll have a new point you can manipulate. If you want to join 2 points, select them both and hit F for fill. If you want to duplicate a rope, just press L or Ctrl L for linked and Shift D to duplicate. When the ropes looked alright, I right-clicked and converted them all to a mesh, chose a face and pressed L or Ctrl L for linked, press U for unwrap, and chose follow active quads. After repeating this process for all of the ropes, I added a displacement modifier set to UV and played around with the wood texture until I got a good result. I then added in some coarse fabric texture and mixed this with the moss texture group I had already made. The only thing missing now was the cloth, so I used the cylinder with its tops cut off, duplicated the glass and expanded it until it reached the outer parts of the rims, and used the shrink wrap modifier to wrap the fabric along the glass's surface. I added in a subdivision modifier to get a smoother surface, and after applying both of the modifiers, I used the elastic deform tool in sculpt mode to pull out the bits so they weren't overlapping with the rims. The texture was basically done the same way as the rope, so I'll just skip that part. Alright, let's go to the final presentation. So yeah, that is basically the lantern sculpt wrapped up. I plan to release the model on Sketchfab over the next few days and will include the Blender file too, so feel free to purchase that for educational purposes, or if you want to use this lantern in your own project, just credit us, and we're happy with however you use the model, to be honest, as long as you don't resell it, of course. But yeah, I'm actually really happy with how the lantern turned out, and I had so much fun in 3D Code. I definitely plan on using that more from now on. If you watched this until the end, you are a true champion. I hope you learned a lot. This edit took a crazy long time to do. Ugh. Next week, Umberjan will finalize and polish NURBEK's design in Photoshop. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and thanks so much for watching, guys. Bye!